to organized crime, the 3 crimes we've mentioned. And as you think through that and listen to the presentations, if you could draw on some concrete and real-life examples of such instruments from within your area of work, could be within your area of work, could be within your region. Secondly, if you can think and share with us some current best practices in Africa with regards to these challenges. We mentioned some challenges yesterday, and based on these challenges and practices, let's think about what lessons and recommendations we could make to ensure effective civil society engagement in addressing these challenges. And finally, what role you believe civil society should have as far as addressing the challenges linked to organized crime, or rather the 3 crimes, and concrete actionable goals. I know it's a mouthful, it's a lot to think about, but as we are thinking through it together, I'm sure that we will be able to come up with some actionable goals to take us forward. The rapporteur for our session will be Anna Bottleberg. She will be working, and we both will be assisted by Aline, to manage our time, but also to be able to write down some points so that we can present them in the afternoon session when rapporteurs tie together what was discussed yesterday and today. And without much ado, I'd like to welcome Dima Sari, I hope I pronounced it correct, to make your presentation. The floor is yours, Dima.
Thank you, Sarah, and you pronounced it beautifully, so thank you for that. I will just share my screen now, if everyone would allow me to do that. While I share my screen, I just wanted to highlight that I'll probably not be able to see the chat anymore. So maybe we can take the questions at the end, if that's okay with everyone. So first of all, let me say thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Aline, and the organizer for all the efforts into organizing this conference and session. It's a very pertinent topics, and at Microsoft, we're very happy to be participating in this very interesting discussion. As you can see, what I would like to focus on, and to the point mentioned by Sarah, is the importance of multi-stakeholder digital diplomacy, and that would be the theme going through my presentation. I realized that there is an interpreter, so I will be a bit slower than usual, which is generally a good thing, but also not to make their life harder than it is. So I'm always fascinated by the role that interpreters can play. I really don't know how they do it. So I'll try to contribute by speaking slowly. So as I said, it's a real pleasure to be with you today, albeit in a virtual forum. Thank you so very much for having Microsoft. It's of course very unfortunate that we're unable to do this in person. I think the good news is that we are starting to travel. My colleagues were in Kenya and Nigeria 2 weeks ago. I'm planning to go to Kenya, and we're planning an executive visit for Microsoft executive across in the next month to Sub-Saharan Africa. So we're really excited about the potential of travel being back, and look forward to having face-to-face events, hopefully in the not too distant future. So by way of context, my profile or my background has been to work at the nexus of tech and policy for more than 13 years now, specifically focused on tech and policy. I was working with Yahoo for 8 years, including during the year where they had one of the first cybersecurity data breach, which was considered the first of its kind at the time, and we'll talk about this a bit today. I was also more recently, for 3 years, a member of a political consultancy focused on the region as well, where we looked at rule of law and combating terrorism and the impact that civil society can play in supporting governments and others in that role. I joined Microsoft only 8 months ago, and I'm as a government affairs lead for the Middle East and Africa, or Africa and the Middle East. And I found it fascinating coming from this background of tech and rule of law and politics to see how Microsoft is incredibly focused on this topic, very active, trying to play a role in digital diplomacy. I think the other fascinating fact that I found working with Microsoft is how serious and committed they are to the continent. Microsoft has been in the continent for more than 3 decades, starting with opening offices. We have a network of more than 12,000 partners that we work closely with. We're invested in connectivity initiatives, skilling initiative, and cybersecurity now is at the core of what we do. So today I would want to discuss with you, outline Microsoft's work related to digital diplomacy, and hopefully that would be a good bridge to answering the 3 questions that were posed by Sarah around what are the best practices. But I think the key takeaway that would be great to get today is how does multi-stakeholder collaboration contribute to this collective goal that we all have? Because when we look at cybersecurity, I think the threat emanating from cyberspace continue to evolve. And accordingly, our approach to countering these threats must evolve as well. And I think to Sarah's point, a key realization in this regard is that no single stakeholder group, be they nation states, industry, or civil society, can be expected to tackle these challenges on our own. Instead, it's crucial to leverage the expertise, experience, and the resources of all the relevant stakeholders, including via a new type of diplomacy, namely what we're calling the multi-stakeholder digital diplomacy. And I think fora like this one today is key in helping us start this conversation about how this contribution can be. And I look forward to hearing from you when we start the discussion. First, let me kick off things with an overview of the cyber threats landscape today. I think the key thing and the positive thing is that the past 2 years have accelerated what was already a rapid transformation in how and when we use digital technology. And I think anyone who would be working with governments would notice how the initial pushback on adopting or transforming digitally processes such as justice system or administrative process, there was a shift, a paradigm shift with the pandemic, where we've seen government agencies and companies and civil society looking to embrace digital technology. We are seeing more people coming online for the first time, alongside the proliferations of new kinds of internet-connected device. The number of these alone is over 31 billion. And I think Africa is a great place to showcase how people are moving directly from having no connectivity to using cutting-edge mobile phones or Internet of Things that allow a real connection into and a real use of technology for the services that they usually use. However, the same digital transformation also creates new challenges and responsibilities, because of course, the threat surface is also expanding. This creates a wider diversity and increases the complexity of the cybersecurity challenges. What that means is that cyber attacks are rapidly escalating in frequency and sophistication, which is increasingly making cybersecurity a top priority for decision makers. And another number to highlight to you from this slide is that when we look at the big picture, it is estimated that the annual costs of cyber attacks to the global economy already exceeds $6 trillion. So what does this mean? For starters, it means that states have been responding in a variety of ways. And if you can see, we have countries with the military cyber capabilities, but we also have more than 100 states, and I'm sure it's more than we're accounting for, investing in domestic legislative initiatives, both to regulate what is permissible online and also to increase the resilience of their domestic critical infrastructure. However, and this will not surprise any of you, I am sure, a number of them are turning to cyberspace into a domain of conflict, similar to what we have in quote unquote physical space. So that increases instability for all the internet users. This is in a nutshell the landscape to which we're proposing action. So I think we can talk about this later, but generally one of the questions that we're asked as we're looking at this is, particularly when we're talking in the sense of cybersecurity, is what are you most concerned about? What keeps you up at night? And when I ask our colleagues at Microsoft who has focused on digital diplomacy, one of the key concerns they mention is that state cyber attacks are on the rise. And I can give you an example from my personal experience. In 2013, you can see here that we were aware of the Yahoo data breach, which you can see between the year 2013 and 2014. What's interesting about it is that at the time, no one would believe that there would be something called a state-sponsored attack. It actually took Yahoo a long time to be aware of the data breach, to escalate it to the right level, and to be able to dissect what was happening behind it. And this is a very interesting slide, and you can find the data at the Strategic and International Studies, because it shows how there's a direct connection between what's happening on a geopolitical level and the increase in cyber attacks that we see. And this is particularly around sophisticated attacks. And if you look at this map, it shows what were the key, it's in line with what were the key events that we were watching, starting with 2011, around the revolutions up until now with COVID. So what does that mean? I feel most of us at this event will have a pretty good idea, but I think where we would want to highlight is that it's not really a fair fight. We need to be coalescing together. It's not about the interest of individual citizens alone. It's not in the interest of civil society alone. It's not the industry and it's not the states. It's all of us. And I think that goes at the core of what we're discussing today. But before we go into the multi-stakeholder approach, let me take a step back and look at the broader threat landscape. And before I do that, Sarah, can I check on time where I am so I can, you're on mute, I think.
All the time. You're good for another 5 minutes.
Perfect, perfect. So I want to highlight the Microsoft Defense Report, and I'll post in the chat a link to the Microsoft Defense Report. But a few things to say about this. This is one of the practices that we see contributing a lot. So Microsoft analyzes a lot of data, around 24 trillion daily security signals, We have a team of almost 8,500 cybersecurity experts, analysts, practitioners, and researchers around Microsoft who are drawing insights from these signals. And so we are able to analyze a lot of data and to counter these by looking at pattern and seeing when there is an increase. Now, what we have focused, and this is where the points that bridges to the civil society, is that most nation-state actors continue to focus their attacks on government agencies, NGOs, and think tanks, rather than on critical infrastructure target. And the objectives appear to be espionage and surveillance primarily. What is worth noting is that these are very sophisticated attackers, and they continue to focus on techniques that help them maintain stealth and access. So, and here's another review of what that, and you will see that in the defense report. So here you could see, for example, where we have 31% of the most targeted sectors being NGOs and think tanks, 48% being in government. Most targeted countries, we don't have a specific number here for African countries, but it gives you an idea of where we're seeing the most activity. So now comes the question of what can be done about all this. And this is where I would like to present our view of the multi-stakeholder approach. First of all, on an individual level, in terms of actionable insights, I think it's encouraging that one of the most reliable and important ways to significantly improve cybersecurity is to have good cybersecurity fundamentals and cyber hygiene. It's still, until 2022, one of the best ways of dealing with cybersecurity, and that is to secure individually your data. And I think raising awareness, training, and capacity building is crucial in order for us to keep protection on an individual level. So basic security hygiene still protects against 98% of the attacks, which is an encouraging number. However, this is not enough, because clearly threats emanating from cyberspace cannot be effectively tackled by any state of their own. So it's important to have these conversations on a multilateral settings. We need to have these multilateral conversations, and so that states, civil society, and industry can work together, leverage each other's experience, expertise, and resources, so that the outcome is greater than the sum of its parts. I wanted to give a quick overview as I was looking yesterday of where's the regulatory landscape in Africa. And I think, let me start from the right. We are seeing a lot of legislative activities, starting with Ghana. South Africa issued a recent law, but then we're also seeing draft laws being discussed in various countries. Another point to mention that countries could use their existing national laws, whether it's the criminal code or civil code or data protection laws, because at the end, the crime is covered, whether it's done in physical space or on the internet. Oh, sorry. But I think a good point to discuss today is how do we look at the regional treaties, such as the Malabo Convention or the African Union Convention of Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection. And why haven't we seen a lot of signing up? What is the reticence of countries in being part of a regional instrument? And then the last point is to discuss is global coordination. We have the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, where we have a lot of African countries who are in the pre-signatory levels and looking to participate. We have the Paris Call for Trust in Cybersecurity in Space, which allows a lot of cooperation between countries and cyber capacity building initiatives. There's a UN resolution, which everyone here would be familiar with, for the kicking off of a treaty on cybercrime. But I think the key point that is important to highlight here is that one of the crucial points is that we need that legal framework to still protect online freedoms. we do not want to be in a position, particularly as we look as industry and civil society, in order to have the internet space that we need to foster innovation and digital transformation and economic recovery. We need to keep that space free. So we don't want overregulation to the point where we are impeding on online freedoms, or actually not in line with the international conventions that we have started since the beginning and since the foundation of the UN and other regulations that are our core principles. So
you have one more minute.
Perfect. So I think when we talk about the Cyber Convention, it's important that we're looking at the core principles, which are, while enforcing international cooperation to keep an open internet, ensure victims are protected, promote transparency, and then adopt a consensus-driven approach. The last point I would mention is that another way to combat cybercrime is cyber capacity building and expertise. Microsoft is invested in that. The African Union, I believe, has had programs around it. And I think on a global level, there's an appetite to provide cyber capacity building expertise. So I would strongly encourage as well civil society, individuals, and countries to see where are the potential, because that remains one of the most effective way. And thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very enlightening presentation. Not just telling us what could go wrong, but also in pointing us on what steps we can take both as individuals as well as states, and most importantly as a civil society, to be able to protect ourselves, reduce our vulnerability, and at the same time, reduce the possibility of threats, so to harden ourselves as targets. Thank you very much. And we'll move now to our second presenter, Louise Edwards, whom I introduced as joining us from African Policing and Civilian Oversight Forum, a coalition of police oversight bodies and practitioners in South Africa. Louise is joining us now from Australia, but will share her thoughts on South Africa. Welcome, Louise. If we could put it on full screen, that would be splendid.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Prof. So thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this conference, to the previous speaker for the, I stopped preparing for my own. It was a fascinating presentation. I learned a lot. So I'm the Director of Research and Programs at the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. I'm usually based in Cape Town, South Africa, but took advantage of the recent border openings to visit some family in Australia. So I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, but I'll be back in Cape Town, back at the office in a couple of weeks. So APCOP is a South African-based not-for-profit trust, and we work on issues of police accountability and governance across Africa. And relevant to this presentation, one of our key areas of work is the provision of technical assistance to regional mechanisms, so such as those at the African Union level, the Southern African Development Community, East African Community, ECOWAS, etc., to develop guidelines and standards to inform not only police accountability, but security sector reform more generally, and relevant to this presentation today, crime and violence prevention. So I'm hoping that the presentation that I've prepared will address some of the questions asked at the beginning. I think it's probably most relevant around issues of instruments and best practice, but we'll see how we go, and I'm always happy to take questions at the end. So I was asked to discuss best practices in responding to illicit trafficking in Africa, and to assist in the formulation of concrete goals for civil society engagement. And in doing this, I actually want to pull the lens back a bit and examine a sub-regional instrument that looks at crime and violence prevention in a broader sense than just illicit trafficking, but we really believe that the guideline is going to provide a methodology that's potentially capable of replication across the continent to be a good practice example of how to put civil society engagement at the centre of strategizing and planning around crime and violence prevention issues, including illicit trafficking in Africa. And certainly the issue of illicit trafficking is a priority area within the Southern African development community, which is where these guidelines have arisen. But I'll get to the issue of implementation towards the end of my presentation. So we can move to the first slide. So just by way of background, so as we're all aware that there's numerous socioeconomic factors such as rapid urbanisation, high levels of unemployment, severe income inequality, poor health and educational outcomes that are often associated with high levels of insecurity. And unfortunately, these challenges from our work are common across the continent. But the argument is that they require a preventive and developmental response that is going to lie beyond just a criminal justice solution. We can't just get tough on crime, throw the might of the police and other security forces at these issues and expect them to get better. And this has really been recognised, as we're all aware, in the Sustainable Development Goals and in Africa 2063 agenda. So in the context of developing these preventive and developmental approaches to crime and violence prevention, understanding and addressing risk and resilience factors, so both individual and community, have also become a very useful theoretical framework for understanding drivers to crime, to violence and to poor safety outcomes. And they're particularly important for promoting upstream and developmental and criminal and non-criminal justice responses. And to do this absolutely requires a voice, a capacity building, and a direct engagement by the communities and the individuals who are the rights holders, the right to safety, right to life, etc. And evidence globally is showing us the importance of ensuring widespread community consultation and participation in the development and implementation of crime and violence prevention planning, strategies and interventions. And this widespread participation is particularly important in an urban environment, as cities are becoming more diverse in populations, and as the specific and lived experiences of crime and violence of each of the different constituent groups within a city becomes more apparent and more explicit. And just the final part in terms of the theoretical background is that there's also a growing evidence base of the effectiveness of participatory tools, such as things like community safety audits and community safety planning in fostering the uptake of initiatives that reduce crime and violence prevention. So this is the kind of the theoretical basis where crime and violence prevention is kind of moving to. And if we can go to the next slide, what we're seeing is an uptake in this theory around preventive and developmental approaches to insecurity, crime and violence, and particularly cross-border crimes in the SADC, in Southern African Development Community, and in East Africa. So where we've seen the most development is in the Southern African Development Community. I'll just use SADC as short from now on, through its police cooperation mechanism, SARPCO, which has developed a mechanism to assist the region and its partners to provide a strategic framework for crime and violence prevention that creates that space for civil society engagement. A similar process is underway in East Africa. We're busy with it at the moment, so we don't have a product yet, but it's very much based on the methodology and the guidelines that I'll talk to you about for the next 5 minutes. So we can move to the next slide. So as I said, I just want to focus on the one that's been adopted. This is the methodology we think provides a good practice example of embedding civil society engagement in a crime prevention capacity. So that's the guidelines on crime and violence prevention. They were adopted in 2018 by the Committee on the Organ, the Committee of Organ on Politics, Defence and Security Cooperation of SADC. And the guidelines create new opportunities for the state, and in this instance, police, to develop partnerships with community through the development of guidelines at the SADC level, that can be done regionally, but it's also a methodology that can be taken and brought to bilateral level and national levels to address issues around regional crime and violence priorities. They provide a methodology to develop strategies and measures that aim to deter crime and violence. So it's not just the response to crime and violence, but the deterrence of crime and violence by addressing those risk factors and the underlying causes and drivers, as I foreshadowed in the introduction. And what the guidelines do is to give member state the tools to develop these comprehensive crime and violence prevention policies, programs and intervention that are going to reduce the risk factors and increase the areas of resilience. And they emphasize that in the only way that you can design and deliver these types of policies is by ensuring that they're both community-based and community-owned. It cannot be simply a top-down approach. It cannot simply be a law enforcement approach. And that recognition of the different domains or spheres of risk or resilience that I've been referring to really highlight the need to have a range of actors in the engine room in the development of these crime and violence sort of strategies. So in terms of civil society, the guidelines are very explicit that in all crime and violence prevention programs, interventions, strategies and policies, they have to be informed by the experiences, the perspectives and the insights of people living in the community where a particular intervention is being planned. 5 minutes? Great. And the process of planning interventions has to be inclusive and participatory, and it's got to be done with meaningful contributions from a wide range of stakeholders. And so within the guidelines themselves, civil society has a number of clearly identified roles. So identifying current risks in the community, so identifying hotspots for criminal activity based on crime and violence stats, identifying safety needs and concerns for groups and particularly vulnerable groups, current efforts to control and respond to crime and violence, and the limitations of current crime and violence responses, suggestions for strengthening current responses and for articulating the demand side of what is community safety. And then my final slide, we can switch to that. So just in terms of the application of the guidelines and its impact on this theme, there is, we believe, the potential for the methodology adopted by the guidelines, which sets out a very clear methodology for how you create an inclusive, development-led crime and safety strategy at any level and with any interaction. So as I said, it can be regional, bilateral, national, community level, and involving a range of actors. And what it does, this methodology, is to foster and create those supportive partnerships within and amongst those different levels of engagement. And it promotes an integrated, effective and efficient delivery of services through encouraging participatory consultation, so that we're not just developing these things in a vacuum. So just finish with a quote from the indicator template that has been developed for these guidelines. And that community-driven implementation relies on the decisions made by community members in partnership with government and stakeholders, and the process of planning interventions is inclusive and participatory, and has to involve meaningful contributions from a wide range of stakeholders. So we think, just in conclusion, that addressing the issue of illicit trafficking is kind of one a key critical crime concern that we're seeing increasingly across the continent, at a regional level, bilaterally and national levels. And we think that a methodology proposed like the SADC crime and violence guidelines, it provides a methodology to bring civil society into the engine room to ensure we're seeing a demand-driven response to these types of crimes. So thank you for the opportunity to make the input. Very happy to answer any questions on these, should any arise.
Thank you for a very, very brilliant, another brilliant presentation that has clearly held us literally by the hand and shown us the door into this wide arena of crime prevention, how we can join hands together as civil society together with state actors, in this case, law enforcement, to be able to use existing instruments, but also sometimes we talk about instruments and potential and available resources without looking at the community as a resource. And therefore, thank you for helping us to look inwards as well before we look outwards towards working towards controlling transnational organized crime. And lots of examples. Thank you very much for a very practical example that can be replicated in the region. We'd like to move to our final presenter, but unfortunately the final presenter hasn't made his way in. So I'd like really at this point, after those two brilliant presentations, to be able to welcome the presenters to, the participants, to be able to talk a bit more and ask questions, seek clarification, and make sure that you get out of our two brilliant presenters what you would like to get out of them. I know we have questions to answer, but if we could start with your questions first, the questions from the room. Anyone with a question, if you would just go ahead and raise your hand. If you can raise your hand using the button, or if you can put your question in the chat, that would be very helpful. I know we come from different regions of Africa. We've heard the brilliant presentations, and I'd like to take the first question from Ana Del Frata. Please go ahead. I apologize if I mispronounce your name.
Thank you very much. No, thank you, Chair. Thank you for your chairing style, really very admirable, calm, and this is what we need for challenging circumstances. So thanks a lot. I wanted really to praise the different elements that present the backbone of this session. The two speakers have really given us something that Louise put it well. She said that she stopped working on what she was doing because she had to listen. And it is exactly what we need. We need this type of cross-fertilization. You know? So we need to learn from each other. And I wanted to ask both speakers if they could say something that is a strength of Africa in the current situation and in dealing with problems that by definition should really put all regions on an equal level because they are cross-border problems. So what is the strength? What can be found in some characteristics of the African communities and something that could be beneficial for developing good practices in dealing with these problems. Thank you.
I don't know who wants to go first, perhaps Dima.
Répondre à cette question en premier, peut-être Dima.
Thank you. I saw Louise raise her hands, but I'm happy to go first. I think it's interesting. Thank you, Anna, for the encouraging comments. And I agree that this is a great forum for us to be discussing ideas and seeing how we can think about next steps. I think the interesting thing about cybersecurity is that it's a global problem. So the dynamics are actually similar in a lot of regions. And that's why taking from best practices from across the world in this area is actually very possible. So I'll start with first saying that it is a global problem and that it requires cross-regional. It's very hard to look at physical boundaries in this world. So the kind of traditional boundaries are dropped and we're looking more towards a global problem. However, from my experience, I've seen some trends, and I will end with some potential next steps that we could think about, is that I think where it's interesting is that we're seeing this trend to have cyber crimes laws being pursued individually by states. So we're seeing draft laws and across those countries that I mentioned, new laws in South Africa and Ghana. We're seeing less regional cooperation. And I think that would be the trend that would be interesting to say. So for example, if we're looking at cyber crimes laws, if we don't have harmonization and each country will issue its own laws and regulations, it becomes really hard for, let's say, an African startup to comply with all these regulations every time they want to move from one country to the other. And the same when it comes to regional initiatives around cyber capacity so because there's the issue of national security, I think regional collaboration is taking a backstand, and how can we move from that into starting this dialogue and working all together, I think would be a key focus that would be great to hear thoughts on and what people think. But that would be a trend that we're seeing, and that would be great to explore and see how we can contribute to explaining that this is not about, there's a benefit even for national security in having this regional discussion and a global discussion eventually.
Thank you, Dima, for that. Louise, did you want to add a rejoinder?
So I think in terms of, so if the problem is illicit trafficking, complex and cross-border organized crime, I think what we're very good at doing on this continent, and where we have actually led the way in many respects, is also where we're weakest. So I'll explain. I think what we're very, very good at doing is, or we're getting better at, is actually in this context, regional cooperation. And regional cooperation, particularly in the identification and the articulation of standards around policing, standards around effective cross-border crime responses and management, and crime and violence prevention. And we're seeing it, this kind of collective concerns around security, collective concerns around crime and violence prevention, and its intersection with development, particularly at the sub-regional level. So we're seeing it in relation to some of the very important work that's happening at the East African community level around the development of common standards for policing. The implementation of those standards is questionable, which will lead me to my next point. We've seen it in the development of the crime and violence guidelines in Southern Africa, and we're seeing it now with ECOWAS and their interest in developing, similar to East Africa, kind of common standards around policing and security sector reform. So we're very good at identifying where the challenges are, but articulating a framework for addressing it that is responsive to our continent's particular needs and constraints. So they are locally driven. And we're actually better than some other regions than doing that. I've been involved in this kind of work for more than 12 years. At the African Union level, I've assisted with the development of standards on, for example, things like policing and pretrial detention, which were better than the European and the inter-American standards at the time, and were more nuanced to the concerns, the demands, and the constraints within which we operate. So I think the articulation of standards, we often say, we say, yeah, but the hard work is in the implementation. And I agree that that's right. But the fact that we're moving to articulate these standards, we're benchmarking what we want to see, I think is very important. Where we have the challenge is in the support for implementation. And I think that's a subject for another conference, how we support as civil society implementation of these standards by states, but how states themselves are kind of looking at their role in terms of articulation versus implementation. But I think we do this very well, and it's setting us up for a nice base. It's just we've got to get the implementation right.
I think that was very enlightening to know what we do well, because sometimes we have to know what we do well just to encourage us to dare to put our feet into the deep end of the things we don't do right. And I think in addition to what you've said, just admitting that, it's hard work, just admitting that the criminals are ahead of us, we are trying to catch up, is an important step, because I've been in certain jurisdictions where they feel they're top of the game, and it's not a very good thing to communicate out there because it poses a challenge. I'm a forensic psychologist, so you understand where I come from. When you tell someone that I'm top of the game, what you're telling them is, you're raising the bar for them and they will cross it. So thank you very much for those two rejoinders. And Anna, thank you very much for your question. We have a question in the chat as well. It's in French. If the interpreter could interpret it for us in English. Eddie has asked a question in French. If one of the interpreters could translate it for us so that we know, we get the gist of it. Just give the interpreter a few minutes to get that done. If they could type it into the chat, that would be splendid.
Sarah, it would be helpful as well to know where the participants, which companies they're representing or authorities.
We'll do that shortly. Thank you very much. While we are waiting, if either Louise or Dima, if you have a report you think is not
Sarah?
Confidential.
Sarah,
Sorry,
can I just tell you that everybody has to select English to listen to the interpreter, otherwise you cannot hear the interpreter, who is actually,
thank you very much.
He started translating, but you could not hear him. So
thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for that. Louise and Dima, if you could just put some links to some non-confidential reports in the chat, which the participants can be able to look up later, just because you presented a lot within such a short time. Thank you, Anna, for that reminder. Could all participants, please, if your preferred language is English, if you could click on English so that the interpreter, as they interpret whatever is written in the chat in French, we can hear it in English. Thank you very much, Anna.
I speak French, so I'm happy to translate Eddie's question quickly and answer it. So I think, Eddie, you pose a good question about the cooperation between Microsoft and government agencies and the sharing. I just shared in the chat the Microsoft Defense Report. This is a public document that we issued. My presentation was entirely based on this report. And you will find a lot of the information that we share with stakeholders, because we truly believe this is a global discussion. I think the other point to mention is that we encourage countries to join the Paris Call, and which allows international cooperation between the states, because some things also remain on a state level. And that's when we're looking at a more, let's say, restricted data, that would be another forum. Finally, I think to end on this point, it's important to highlight that we do not want, and I'm not saying that this is particularly the point, but it's good to emphasize, especially that now we're in the context of the UN Forum and the civil society, that the conservation of a free internet for all and having those principles that are so dear and that allowed the internet to develop, such as freedom to use the internet, transparency, making sure that lawful access remains a crucial point that we're all abiding by, is equally important. And we would not want the cybersecurity element to impede on those commitments that we've made, all of us together as global stakeholders, to allow the free internet. So I think the balance between both is very important. And I've shared the report that we publish regularly so that everyone can have access to this data.
Thank you very much for sharing that. We will now take a short break, and then when we come back, we'd like to wrap up the session. One of the things we are going to do in wrapping up is before the two speakers give us their final thoughts, some key thoughts, if participants could write in the chat any questions during this break, so that when we come, we can address those questions first, so that you don't go away with any question unanswered. So we will do that. So we will take a 15-minute break now. Aline, am I correct? It's 15 minutes?
I actually have a conflict personally in 15 minutes. I thought it was 10 to 12:30. I might be mistaken.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what time you're on. It's 11:15 Nairobi time now. So if we come back, it will be 11:30.
Oh, okay.
Nairobi time. So we will have Nairobi time. So we'll take that break, and when we come back, we will answer any questions that may be in the chat, and then the two presenters will give us their final thoughts. So do take a break now, a comfort break, and see you in 16 minutes time. Thank you, colleagues, for coming back. Thank you for the brilliant presentations, and thank you for coming back on time. We will have about half an hour, and then we'll have a slightly earlier break for lunch. But before we do that, and before our presenters wrap up, I'd like to draw our attention to the chat. Louise, there's a question there for you. I don't know if you've seen it. About restorative justice. I'll just read out the question. I'm making my way there. Okay. Yeah, got it. Okay. Yeah, so, sorry, there's a question for Dima and there's a question for Louise. Dima, are you still with us? Okay, Dima, if you can draw your attention to the question by Dominique while we listen to Louise respond to the question.
I think Sarah, Dima is not here yet.
Yeah, she's not here yet.
She's actually entering right now, just in that second.
Okay, we'll let Louise respond to her question. Louise, have you seen it?
Is that the restorative justice one? Yeah, I just read it now.
Yes, the restorative justice. People are posting, so things, it's quite exciting. People are posting questions. It's just moving so fast. Dima, there's a question for you in the chat. A question from, God, it keeps moving. It's saying, hello, everyone. I have a question for Dima Sari. I'll just read it in case Dima hasn't seen it. Yeah, there you are. The person is asking, and then I'd let you prepare for that while Louise responds to us. Mine keeps moving a lot. In the spirit of collaboration and strengthening international cooperation, can we expect Microsoft reports and analysis to be made available? Have you seen that question?
I think this is the one in French that I responded to prior to the session, and just to summarize, I shared them.
So you can be able to share it in your summary in case anything comes up. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Meanwhile, I'll give if I can give Louise an opportunity to respond to the question about restorative justice, which is in the chat, and then we'll come to unless anyone has another question, we'll give you the opportunity, Dima, to summarize some key points of your presentation, which you might not have had sufficient time to delve into. I'll give you about 10 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back to Louise to wrap up. But for now, I'll let Louise first respond to the question. Yes, please, Louise.
Thanks, Prof. I don't have a very strong view on this because I haven't really thought through the implications, but I mean, theoretically, it would depend on the nature of the crime and the views of those who've experienced the impact of the crime, sort of whether individually or as part of a community. So I don't necessarily think restorative justice is an appropriate option for all incidences of harm, but I firmly believe that it should be available as an option where both the harmed party and the responsible party fully and freely consent to participate in the process. So in a case of a cybercrime, I mean, if you've got and can identify the perpetrator and the victim, loosely defined, either the individual directly harmed or a person as part of an identifiable community who's experienced harm as a consequence. Yeah, I mean, I think it should be available as an option, but it just requires free and informed consent by all parties to do it. But it's an interesting question. Just sort of shows with the cybercrime stuff how quickly our responses to this need to evolve, and so our thinking needs to catch up a bit. But thanks for the question, Dominique.
Yeah, restorative justice is one of those areas being explored as alternative paths to justice. And I live in a country where even for serious crimes, that window is still open. although we want a deterrent, so we kind of want that person to realize things are serious. But here in Somaliland, for restorative justice, the courts give an opportunity to to mend the relationship, because we are a post-conflict society. So much as there is the need for retribution, for the person to be punished, but they're very conscious about the very thin line they're treading in a community that's come back from conflict. So what actually happens is they let the elders of both two groups talk about the broken relationship and let someone, say why they did this, so they know the impact on individuals. So the indigenous system of criminal justice still works here, as well as Ethiopia. I mean, Somaliland, Ethiopia, Djibouti, it still works, but only if the victim accepts for it to take precedence, because I think victim impact is very important in most crimes, crimes against the person, but crimes against cyber crimes and certain crimes that I know you're dealing with in, not just in South Africa, in East Africa as well, cross-border crimes. They may cross to a jurisdiction where restorative justice isn't given such preeminence, and therefore, sovereign states have to take precedence. So I don't know whether maybe Dima can touch on it if it comes up, the issue of using of restorative justice, but I agree with you, Louise. It's still a very new area, and we're still dealing with very serious crimes. So again, that's why sometimes, as Louise said, it's not always possible for us to harmonize our national and regional interests, because sometimes it's a threat to national security. Where I come from in Kenya, it could, if we go the restorative way and not allow for due process, for people to go through the process, one community may feel that, especially if the community is a victim as well, because they're related to the person who died, it could lead to clashes between different communities. So again, a very good question, but one of those areas we are still learning. There's also an observation just before Dima, you come in. Joyce, I don't know, Joyce, if you're still here. Joyce, you mentioned that listening to this has reminded you about an investigative piece of one of our partners called Arts for Rights. They did on, my screen keeps moving a bit. They did on a gang called Confirm in Nakuru, Kenya, that were heavily involved in cybercrime. Is that something you wanted us to touch on, or just watch the video you've posted? Joyce, I don't know if you're still there.
Hi, I'm still here. No,
yes.
No, I just wanted you to, it was just for sharing. So maybe in future, if one is interested, they can watch that during the free time. Yeah, it wasn't just for a discussion. It was just a point of sharing.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting one.
Okay. Were there any points that you'd have liked clarified, or it's just a piece for us to watch, like you said?
I think for me, what stood out is listening to both presenters is when the partners were doing this video, they didn't bring out the issue of the law that governs cybercrime and stuff. And so just looking at it, I was thinking as a way forward, it would be very interesting if we can have like partners who can be able to, even do an independent documentary on what laws are available there. Some of them I'm hearing them for the first time. Some of them I've read about it, but it would be very interesting if we can even being given information out there that talks about basically policies and laws that are in place. Especially today, I was looking at the presentation by Microsoft, and I didn't know so many countries have in the process of coming up with self-regulation measures and discussions. And for me, that was really enlightening. So eye-opening. So thank you so much for that. Thank you.
So just a bit more information, yeah?
Yeah, a little bit more of information.
So that's a good thing to hear from civil society. And it's good that you could relate it to that case, but also saying that we need a bit more information. So perhaps an information forum. I know that we have, trying to remember, Alain, the one that starts with S, the repository for information. UNODC has a repository for information, Joyce, that you could sign up. It has case studies, it has legislations, and it is very useful. I'll remember the name. While I remember the name, can we take the question from Danny Tiwa? Danny, your hand is up. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, great. I actually wanted to ask a question that is closely related to the first question that we are supposed to address today. You know, the one about the instrument that can be used to tackle organized crime. So I, as a criminologist, especially as a critical criminologist, we used to kind of call attention, you know, on the other organized criminal out there. Because when we talk of organized crime, we tend to look at, you know, all the gangs and all the, you know, small people in the street, or, you know, but there are also, you know, very powerful people that are involved in organized crime, some of them with very official, you know, title. In critical criminology, we talk of, you know, state organized crime, crimes of the powerful, this kind of concept. So my question is there any instrument out there to ensure that this type of actors that are also part of the organized crime landscape, you know, are also checked? I have in mind, for instance, that in Cameroon, especially when it comes to cyber crime, I don't know if this should be framed as a cyber crime. In 2017, when the crisis started in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon, internet was simply shut down for, I don't know, for like forever. I mean, it lasted for many months. And I mean, they are concerned about this kind of behavior, you know, on the behalf of, you know, those who yield state power, sometimes with very small or very, you know, limited legitimacy. So the question is, you know, I mean, Professor Sarah is there. There are people that are Louis Edward is there. You know, you have a lot of experience in observing the African landscape. My question is there any instrument out there to keep on this kind of behavior in checks? Thank you very much.
Louise or Dima, either of you who would like to respond to that? An instrument to, I guess, keep people in check apart from the law. Is that what you're saying, Danny? I
don't know, maybe a protocol or a sort of regional agreement, you know, just to ensure that.
In which country?
I mean, as long as it is in Africa. I know in Central Africa there's nothing, but perhaps elsewhere, you know, there have been moves to ensure that states also abide by some kind of rule, you know, when it comes to, for instance, dealing with, I don't know, with, I won't say rebellion, but with protest, with civil protest, you know, with opponent, opposition, widespread opposition in their own countries, you know, when it comes to the use of internet. I don't know if, yeah, I saw that Louise Edward has raised her hand, maybe.
Yes, Louise has raised her hand, but also just in response to what you're saying, Central Africa has nothing. As long as a country is under, is a state party to African Union, you have a fallback position. If there is no national legislation governing a particular thing, you can fall back on the regional one. That's why we are looking at these different instruments. And maybe, Louise, in your response, you could, if you could touch a bit upon if someone is in a country, I know, but I prefer that it comes from you too. If someone is in a country and the country doesn't have a legislation on a particular aspect, again, sorry, this was a question on cybercrime, but you've already talked about regional cooperation. How people can know what to fall back on. They can go to the regional, they can go to the international if their country is a signatory or has ratified. Maybe in your response, you can touch a bit on that. Louise?
Thank you, Prof, and thanks for the interesting question. And you are, well, this goes back to my response to that question around what Africa does well. And what we do very well is setting standards at a regional level. So the question that you're asking, I would actually frame as a human rights question. So what is it that we're saying that the states are doing? And what are we saying that we want the states not to do? And what is the basis for which we're asking the states to refrain? And here I'm a human rights lawyer, human rights attorney, so I always look at it from that angle. I'm an international lawyer as well, is that there's a very strong regional human rights framework that speaks directly to this issue around access to information, freedom of expression, and how that intersects with the trend of internet and social media shutdown, and questions around sort of repression there. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll copy them now into the chat. But at the African Union level, through the mechanism of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, we've got a resolution that speaks directly to this issue. And the online version of that resolution will give you links to all the instruments that inform the position of the Commission. And in terms of how you implement it, if your country doesn't have specific cybercrime laws, if your country doesn't have specific protections around, keeping the internet open, etc., what the country is likely to have, because most African countries have it, is a Bill of Rights. And that Bill of Rights, 9 times out of 10, will include freedom of expression and access to information. And then that becomes a question of arguing that in the courts. And you could certainly make a constitutional argument for, and a human rights argument, provided you get the Bill of Rights, for access to information and freedom of expression. So I'm going to copy that resolution. It's got links to all of the interpretive instruments, which we don't really have time to go into, and I'm happy to follow up if you want assistance in terms of understanding the application of a resolution like that to a national context.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that rejoinder and the very good question. I'll now turn to Dima Sari. Dima, if you could sum up your thoughts in about 5 minutes, and then Louise, wrap up in 5 minutes, and then I will give some closing comments. Dima, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the participants for this very engaging discussion. It's definitely eye-opening to hear your thoughts. I like where we are in the discussion today, because that's an equally important point to keep in mind as we're dealing with cyber crimes. And I think it's essential that we're having this discussion in the backlog of all the covenants and commitments that countries have made around Bill of Rights, human rights, and at the end, the protection of a free internet, and making sure that any cybersecurity measure that we're taking does not impede on those commitments that are so crucial to the evolution of the digital transformation of the continent. I think in my closing remarks, I want to go back to one of the points that I mentioned initially, which is how at Microsoft, we're truly committed to the digital transformation of the continent. For 3 decades now, the company has been immersed with the African countries, whether by opening offices or investing in our partners through skilling, connectivity, and looking to close the digital divide. And this is the driver primarily to our discussions today. We truly believe in the potential that the continent has. You're going to have the most youthful population in any world. The innovation that we're seeing from people, even in the moment you have connectivity, the innovation that we're seeing in terms of how people are using the internet is fascinating. We have a connectivity project, for example, in Kenya with a partner called Mawingu. And just to see what women have done with connectivity is just truly, truly inspiring. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that what we're trying to do today is protect the victims from cyber attacks. And that should be crucial to our approach. And that's why, to summarize, I would love to go back to the 3 points. One is protecting ourselves on the individual level, and we can do this with tightening the security, so closing the door, to use the metaphor. Laws and regulations are incredibly important. International instruments are incredibly important, but I think we do have enough instruments, whether it's the Budapest Convention, whether it's the Paris Call, potentially if we have a cybersecurity convention, but we still don't want it, to Louise's point, to impede on any of the human rights that are as crucial to our discussion today. And then the third element, and where this is more of an invitation, we're seeing a lot of cyber expertise capacity building initiatives. And if to go to Louise's point, since regional cooperation is one of the things that we at the continent do the best, how can we leverage that to do this, to leverage those resources that we have in terms of cyber capacity building, not only for law enforcement agencies, but also for youth looking for the job of the future as well, and training them, for the civil society who are getting a lot of the attacks. So I think these 3 elements is how I would end. And thank you, Sarah, for really like a lovely moderation of this session, for the participants, for the engagement. And Louise, you opened my mind on a lot of issues, and I hope we stay in touch as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those kind words, those inspiring words, and a concise summary. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you, Dima, and thank you, Prof. Yeah, it's been really fascinating. I don't work so much in the cyberspace kind of realm, and so I've learned a lot myself. It's been quite eye-opening, and I think it's an area we, looking at issues around policing and police oversight, need to kind of get better acquainted with. So thank you. It's been fascinating. So I was asked to talk about, best practices around illicit trafficking and formulating concrete goals for civil society engagement. And what I did was to not go into the specificities around this issue of illicit trafficking, but to pull the lens back and look more broadly at what kind of best practices and methodologies can we point to that are homegrown by African mechanisms for African communities that can assist us in developing methodologies to address cross-border and serious crimes like illicit trafficking, which bring in a civil society element. And we don't have to theorize about it. We've got it. We've got things like the SADC guidelines on crime and violence prevention, which are a step-by-step on the development of crime and violence prevention strategies, tools, interventions, a range of things that we can do, which put the voices of the communities who are most impacted by these crimes at the heart of it, as both an outcome of the processes, but they themselves influencing the process. So we are very good at developing these kind of guidelines. We're not so great at implementing them. So I've shared a copy on the chat. So for anybody interested in those types of methodologies for addressing these types of cross-border and serious crimes with a civil society engagement built into it, I'd highly recommend you look at the SADC guidelines. And as APCOF, we did the technical assistance to develop them. So stand very ready to engage with anybody interested in looking at that methodology as something they could take forward in relation to any of the specific forms of crime being discussed as part of this conference. So yeah, I thank you for the opportunity, and I'll share my contact details now in the chat.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much, Dima, for your brilliant presentations. You have not just enlightened us, you have, as we would put it in my native mother tongue, Luo, you have educated us. You have educated us into knowing how to keep ourselves safe. And I'm saying educated us because crime is evolving. Illicit trafficking, we were told yesterday, is evolving. The criminals are ahead of the pack, and we have to up our game. We have to know what is changing. You gave us some evidence, Dima, evidence of the numbers could speak for themselves in telling us how much it is cost, how many users there are, potential victims, including us, how much it is costing the world to be able to in breaches, cyber breaches. You also give us an idea about the number of countries who are now taking steps forward to try and come up with the legislation. And you both gave us very practical ways in which the civil society could get involved. As a conference led by the civil society and for the civil society engagement, you have signposted us to very, very helpful ways in which we could be able to protect ourselves, reduce our vulnerability, but also reduce the vulnerability of our families, our communities, and our country. Therefore, as civil society members, I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. You've also given us challenges, challenges for which we came to this conference to know what we can do, or if we are doing it, how to do it better. And if we have to do it better, what exactly, exact ways in which we could get involved. When I listen to Louise and how the community and engagement, I see an open door. In Africa, we learn a lot from each other, and therefore we are learning from how civil society made a stake, not just a stakeholder as a recipient of services, but also we actually can get involved in tailoring the different strategies and the guidelines. So therefore, each one of us takes back to our region much food for thought. And you've put for us links, which is good, so that we can follow up. We have some homework to do. And I have you to thank for this beautiful session, this engaging session in which you've educated us, but you've also helped us to understand better what is happening. Cyber, of course, is sans frontier. Yeah, there's no border. And therefore, that is very important for me in Somaliland, because we live in a country where there's a lot of radicalization and it is happening online. So thank you all very much for your active participation. Thank you very much for facilitating this session. Thank you, the interpreters, for helping us to be able to have a dialogue in different languages. And thank you, the rapporteur, Anne Bottleberg, for writing down, documenting our discussions. Thank you, Milena. Thank you, Aline, Maria Laura, and both the interpreters. Now I will hand you over to Elaine, who will give us some housekeeping and give us permission to go for lunch.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And also from me, thank you very much for the great morning session. Thank you so much, Dima and Luis, for the very comprehensive and very interesting presentations. And also all the interesting questions that were raised in the chat. I think it was a very interesting discussion that we had. And for also, above all, thank you so much, Sarah, for the very great, engaging moderation, which was really, really great. Thank you very much. And of course, thank you to the interpreters and to Milena and Maria Laura for their support as well in the background. And so, yeah, I will now happily release you into the lunch break. We will resume with the plenary at 1:15 East Africa time. So, and we also kindly ask the rapporteurs to be there 5 minutes before, so at 1:10, if that would be possible. And I will post the link to the chat, the plenary in the chat. So it's not the same link as this session right now. So you'll have to end this meeting and enter the new session as of 1:15. And yes, thank you again, and have a good lunch break, everyone.
If I could request that we leave the chat open for a while, so that people can get the link and the link to the next session, but also get the useful links that our colleagues have put in the chat.
Of course, I will leave the chat open and the whole meeting until 1:10. I think, if that's fine for everyone. And as I said, we will also, as I posted in the chat, you can find all the links and the presentations that were raised today on the link to the VNGOC. I'll post it again as well. Thank you very much,
everyone, and enjoy your lunch. Bon appetit.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.